so that you can stand there and work in them. Whereas raised beds are usually, now you can raise a bed from the ground up that high. You have to get a lot more soil in there. Uh, so that can work too, but most raised beds are about knee height. People can just sit on the wall and garden, and that's fine too. And that for that, the sandy loam, well, any of these will still work. The decomposed granite, a lot of people like that because it's very clean. And generally, the sources of these soils, we find that there's fewer weed seeds in decomposed granite than there is in, if you buy a bulk of sandy loam and you start gardening it, a lot of times you get all these weeds that live near rivers because sandy loam is taken from riverbeds, whereas decomposed granite never made it to the riverbed. So there's tends to be fewer weeds or fewer noxious weeds, and decomposed granite comes with it in bulk soil. Just some side notes there. So the other thing we have to worry about in doing a garden, so that's the soil. Now the other thing you have to do in organic gardening or sustainable gardening is make sure you rotate your crops. So in nature, there is something called succession of plants. So like generally, if you have a bare piece of land that comes on, first you get weeds like grasses or mustard. Around here, you get a lot of mustard growing. Uh, they create the organic matter on top of the ground, and then you have other plants coming in that compete with them for the nutrients that this created. Um, but plants generally can't live in the same spot over time. So, like in a prairie setting in the Midwest, there's maybe 8 or 10 species of plants that live there, and you never have all the same plant living. Except, if you clear off an empty lot, maybe it'll all be mustard for one year. But after that, you start getting all these other plants in there because each crop that is grown, each plant that's growing as it ages and dies, it creates conditions that are not good for its health, just because of the fact that parts of itself die. So another plant comes in and finds it to be a healthier for it. And then so it takes over that area. And then as it grows and ages, the same thing happens. It creates conditions that are not healthy for it to live. So it dies off and something else comes. And that's natural in nature. And that's what farmers have to follow too, is that every crop they put in, once the crop's over, it's dead bodies of that crop. And it's not suitable for to grow that again. So the little one piece of paper that we have here, um, we listed the crop families, the vegetable families on it. Like most people plant tomatoes. Well, tomatoes are the same family as eggplant, peppers, potatoes, tomatillos. They're all close related. All of them, as they age and die, will create a lot of the same diseases. Diseases that hurt tomatoes will hurt peppers, will hurt tomatillos and potatoes. So the farmer has to keep track of this. So if you grow tomatoes one time, the next crop has got to be something unrelated in one of these other families. So we list the different families of vegetables. Uh, and a friend of mine who is a farmer says that the organic farmer in Irvine, well, throughout Orange County, in fact, they have several plots of land that they lease. They go follow a 10 crop rotation cycle. So they don't plant the same crop for 10 crops. And that takes at least 4 years. We were there leasing land on their property for 4 years and never saw them plant the same crop in the same plot of soil twice in the 4 years we were there. So we know it takes them at least 4 years. Some crops, are 3 months, some are 5 months, some are 8 months. Depends on what crop they're growing, but apparently it takes them at least 4 years to get through those 10 crops. And then they go back to they told us their money making crop, the best money making crop is strawberries. And a lot of the crops they grow are totally, a wash. They don't make any money on them. However, they need them as part of the rotation cycle. Cabbage, A lot of that stuff, they can't make any money on cabbage, but they grow it just to get to the next crop so that they can get back to strawberries, which makes them the most money. Now in modern California, maybe the most valuable crop would be grow marijuana one season. So, okay, so you do have to follow crop rotation. So if you've got a garden, it is nice to have, 3 beds minimum, 4 beds better, even more if you can do it, if you have the land for it. And they don't have to be that big, they just have to be separated. There is something called square foot gardening where they plant everything in the same bed with 1 square foot compartments. There's to put corn, tomatoes, beans, those puts. But they found out over the years how to handle that because you use real dirt in there, it's not going to work too well because every time you pull a plant out when it's too old, you leave a whole bunch of roots behind. And those dead roots hurt the plants. So what they've done is they've modified their system to make this thing work. Because the advantage of having mixed plantings like this is that you don't get many bugs or diseases that can figure this out. If you have corn next to tomatoes next to squash next to radishes all growing at the same time, what bug or the bugs generally find their source of prey by smell, sometimes by sight, but usually it's by smell. And if you've got a mixed line of plants in here, um, you're not going to get as many bugs, and the disease can't pass from one plant to the next if they're not related. So you get fewer diseases or pests on the plants. But if you don't use the correct soil, then your roots are going to suffer in the future because you're planting among dead relatives. So what they've had to do is most of the modern or the newest people who do square foot gardening have used a lot of vermiculite and perlite and peat moss in their soil mix. This stuff is so soft. You pull the plant out of there, most of the roots don't break off. So they have to use a totally different kind of soil that'll permit pulling the plants out without leaving the roots behind. So it's doable if you make those modifications, which is, it's kind of a pain. So if you just do a crop rotation, of course you're going to get more pests if you do all the same crop in the same bed. So that's the disadvantages of it. But then you can use what nature is using, whereas this doesn't seem all that natural. No, vermiculite, if you use it long enough, it starts looking like clay because that's what it is. It's puffed up clay. So it in itself may not be sustainable for many years just because this gets really gooey as it ages. So, but if you did a mixture of vermiculite and perlite and all those things that are real super light, now truthfully, there are some natural pumice materials that are really lightweight, but having to transport those across country, the cost is going to really go up. So it's better just to work with real dirt, generally in theory, with real dirt and let nature's rules create how you garden. So with that note on square foot gardening, because there are people who do it, but they have to do it a certain way. So if you have 4 different beds, then say you do tomatoes and your peppers and your eggplant in one bed one year, next year you move it to this bed, next year you move it to that bed, and then that bed, and then you go back to the first bed and start over again. Now, when I was younger, I had a large yard and I had a lot of time on my hands. Yeah, we planted tomatoes in the same spot as year after year to see what happens to them because we wanted to see this in action. This reason why you have to rotate crops. So, of course, the first year the plant was great, made a lot of fruit. Planted the same spot the second year, it was about 80% as good. It started yellowing after 3 or 4 months, so we knew there was some root diseases going on in there. So this crop was still pretty good. So You go, okay, that's not bad. Third year we did it, wouldn't even make a crop. The tomato plant just turned yellow, got root rot, died before it produced. And we couldn't really plant tomatoes again there for 3 more years. So it would have been better if we didn't do it 2 years in a row and just switch and switch and switch. The worst crop they said for not rotating is cucumber. And I, back in the 80s, before I knew all this stuff, yeah, I planted cucumbers, great crop that first year. So I said, okay, put cucumbers in the same spot the next year. Wouldn't even flower. They just grew and turned yellow. They grew for a few weeks, turned yellow, and died. No crop. So cucumbers are supposed to be the most sensitive to not rotating crops. But all crops are affected somewhat by not rotating. Well, that may not be true. The grasses in nature are really tolerant of living in the same places over and over again. That's why your lawn can go for decades. The same lawn can keep going. It's very tolerant of regrowing in the same area. Although, if you've ever grown a lawn, you know the first year you plant it, it looks by far the best. And as the years goes on, it gets, everything gets smaller and shorter and uglier as the lawn ages. Interestingly, on the grass, if you want to revive it, you thatch it. You're combing out all the dead stuff that's building up on the ground, and suddenly it looks a few years younger after you thatch it. So that removal of the dead stuff in the ground or on top of the ground is important for soil, for the health of that particular plant. Now, if it's more permanent crops, like one interesting one is Napa Valley and the grapes. I think I might have talked about this last week, but I've read, now I don't know if this is still true, that Napa Valley only allows the farmers there to grow grapes because that's Napa Valley. But grape plants eventually get old. At 30, 40 years the ground, they get less productive. And it would be wise for them to pull it out and plant a different crop, but they're not allowed to. So what they have to do is they pull out the old grapes and they have to leave the land fallow, which essentially means they have to grow weeds for 10 years to wait for all those dead, dead grape roots to decompose and be totally gone, no remnants left. And then they can plant new grapes again. It's like they say it's the ground's been energized by being fallow. No, I just waiting for the dead stuff to disappear. It's got nothing to do with regenerating or rejuvenating the soil. You have to wait for the dead stuff to disappear before the plants can grow vigorously again. And in the case of woody plants, at least 10 years. And they found that in orchards too. If you somewhat, one tree dies in the middle of an orchard, and say it's especially an apple orchard, which can go for over 100 years, apples are real tolerant of, of their own dead roots. Um, they found that they have to replace a bit of soil because the apple tree will not grow in that same soil twice. And they say, okay, there's something wrong with this dirt. And they found that if they So they did several tests. They said, okay, how do if we compare this apple we put in the original soil of the original orchard, just remove the dead tree, and then new soil from another farm into this old orchard where they moved the dead tree and the dead soil around it and put this new soil in, or just started a new apple tree in a new orchard, what would do the best? It turned out it was the new apple tree in the old orchard in new dirt did better than starting a new apple tree in a new orchard. That was interesting. So they said that they think that what happens is all the apple tree roots connect together. It's like a family in there after a while. And if you get the new apple tree in clean dirt in the old orchard, it has more help than new apple trees and new orchards where there's no existing root system there. So that was interesting that they did. But anyway, so have number of different planting areas, and if you plant growing pots, same thing goes. Just treat each pot like a different bed. So you keep moving your plants. You have to keep track of that because you really can't put the same thing. I remember once we had used the sand for growing for housing our bare root roses. So the rose would actually grow roots in there. And then next every year we put the bare roses in the same sand, let them, they would be in there for a few months, actually starting to grow because they grow right away when we get them. Then we pull them out and sell them to customers. I remember one of the year we told my employees, well, let's plant the roses in our, using the soil from the bare root beds because it's quite nice. But they didn't switch it up. They used the sand that they were holding the roses in instead of, we do bare roses and bare root fruit trees at that time. They should have used the sand from the bare root fruit trees to grow the roses, and they didn't. And all the roses that were in the sand that were growing, that were housing the bare root roses, those roses were really yellow for a long time. It took us a long time to get them greened up. Whereas in the other sand that wasn't growing the roses, they was fine. So the crop rotation is important. The other thing they're trying to teach farmers, so it's going to take a long time because farmers, they were taught conventional methods in the, conventional method of farming started in the 20th century, essentially when they invented tractors that can till huge areas of farmland really quick. Of course, several hundred years ago they had donkeys and plows, or horses and plows, or cows and plows, and things like that. They were doing that same thing, tilling the ground. But now we know that it's important for most crops anyway not to till the soil because the soil has several layers in it, and each layer has different organisms living it on the surface. A few inches below that, there's different organisms. And one of the most important is a fungus called the mycorrhizal fungi. And for most plants, for most of the crops that we grow, that's a real important symbiotic partner that lives in the ground. And they don't like you to plow the soil up. Every time you plow the soil, it kind of cuts them to a million pieces. They're not real happy about that. Fungi will usually recover from that because almost every cell seems to be a separate part. They rejuvenate real well from different pieces of themselves, but they're not really happy with that. And certainly there's a lot of beneficial microscopic worms that live in the ground, beneficial nematodes, other beneficial organisms. And when you turn the soil over, you're putting the surface of the soil down deep and down deep on the surface. It just turns the world upside down. They have to regroup. So tilling, it seems to be a real nasty thing to do. Plus, tilling also um, puts a lot of oxygen in the ground and it decomposes all the dead roots that are in the ground really quickly. So the what do you call it? The people who are monitoring CO2 find that every time farmers plow their fields in the spring, huge clouds of CO2 are released from the soil because they're aerating all those dead roots in the ground. They're decomposing a little faster than carbon dioxide. Now, again, I'm not sure that that's negative because the plants need the CO2 later to, they notice that early in the year the farms are creating CO2. In the summer, they're all absorbing it because the plants have to put it back in. So I'm not sure if that's a total negative to plow and allow the release of all that CO2, but there are better ways really, and nature doesn't do plowing. So certainly that's something we can work on in the future. But mycorrhizal fungus is one reason. The mycorrhizal fungus is nature's most important recycler. Compost bacteria are not. They're part of the system, but they said the majority of nutrients recycled in nature through this mycorrhizal fungi. The mycorrhizal fungi partnered up with plants. They said when plants came on land from the oceans, billions of years ago, whenever that was, they said the plants couldn't eat the rocks that were on this. They couldn't get any minerals out of the rocks. This fungus can do stuff like that, so they had to partner up with this mycorrhizal fungus. So most of the plants in nature, especially the older evolved plants, have a mycorrhizal fungus that they need to live with in order to be successful. Now, you don't have to add it. Most of the quote up to date fertilizer companies add it just because they can say this is important. Now, it is important in containers. So we will admit having the mycorrhizals in every bag, having the mycorrhizals in every bag of Dr. Earth or EV Stone or one of those major brands of organic fertilizer isn't necessary. If they just had one bag with it in there, because you only have to introduce it one time to a container, not over and over and over, it doesn't need it. But just to be, really good about it, every bag of fertilizer we get from Doctor has mycorrhizal fungi, also bacteria that break down things to make sure that this product works wherever they put it. Because this is organic, the plants can't eat this. This mycorrhizal fungi or the bacteria have to eat it first, and then the plants get it. So the mycorrhizal fungi, the bacteria are important. Um, Now, on the back of this sheet, we have the minerals that plants are made of. So, as far as fertilizer goes, there are about 12 essential things that plants need to soil if it's not there already. So, you look on this list, plants are made out of 7 units, and it might be more, but so we have carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. Those are by far the most important minerals in the plant, but those are generally considered free. I mean, they're not exactly free, but carbon and oxygen are in carbon dioxide in the air, hydrogen's in the water, a little bit in the air too. So those we consider free fertilizer, free minerals that the plants, and that's the bulk of the plant are those three things. The things that we have to add, the macronutrients we call them, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. Now they're usually listed in different order on these products. The numbers on these boxes, 322 is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium instead of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. I wish they rearranged them because they always their mind's always keying on phosphorus, but you can see in a plant generally on this. Well, let's put the numbers down. So 45%, 45%, 6%, 1.5%, 1%, 0.2%. And what's interesting is the next one, calcium, would also be considered uh, macronutrients because it makes up more than the phosphorus. The calcium is usually in good quantity in the ground, so it's not something we often have to add, but it certainly helps to make sure there's enough calcium there too. Then we have magnesium, so only 0.2. Now we're kind of going to the micronutrients. 0.1 iron. Like like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, iron was the big thing. It's like now point 0.01 chlorine, 0.01. And then you really get small. Let's go running out of room here. Let's abbreviate manganese, 0.005, boron, 0.002, zinc, 0.002 copper, 0.0006 molybdenum, 0.0000001, and then nickel and cobalt. Very smaller than that. They're all essential though. Every plant has all these in there. We think silica is also part of many plants or all plants, but because soil is silica, silicon dioxide, you shouldn't have to add it unless you're growing plants in an artificial medium. You shouldn't have to add in silica because the research has shown if you spray, plants grown either hydroponically or quote organically in organic soils, which it seems to be totally weird. They have to add silica to make them healthier because there's no dirt in quote certified organic garden growing. It's like, huh? Well, in nurseries. So in nurseries, there is a certified organic thing that you have to do, and they don't, and you're not using silicon. So it's like really weird. Something backwards that our industry is doing. So we don't buy anything that's certified organic because it's not growing in dirt. It's growing in something that just died, which doesn't make sense to us. So anyway, these are the minerals. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Those things create what the plant does, what the leaf of a plant is doing with carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, it's turning into sugar. So that's the main job of plants. These are solar panels. They collect the sun's energy. And inside the leaf, the little chloroplasts are taking carbon dioxide and water and creating sugar, with oxygen as being one of the byproducts of it. So sugar and oxygen. Most of the sugar is used to create the plant. So plants are made out of cellulose. All that is a string of sugar molecules rearranged slightly so we can't digest them. No mammal can digest cellulose. The mammals that eat plants that can actually consume the cellulose are things that have bacteria in the guts that do the job for them. So cows uh, have two stomachs, I guess it is called. One that houses the bacteria that turn the cellulose back into sugar. And they say, the weirdest one is beavers. They have to eat the wood twice because the first time they eat it, it introduces the bacteria to it. The bacteria are turning the cellulose into sugar. And then after they poop it out, they got to eat it again. Like, I don't want to be a beaver. You have to eat your food twice to get the nutrition out of it. So, and then termites can't even eat cellulose. They have bacteria in their guts that turn the cellulose into sugar. So, and like there's boring beetles in trees. Most of them bring along a fungus with them to eat the cellulose and turn it into sugar that they can eat. Well, it turns into fungus. The beetles eat the fungus. So anyway, um, now it's eyes. So anyway, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen become the cellulose of the plant, which is the main body of the plant. The nitrogen is the membranes around all the cells. On us, it's our skin and our hairs, and every membrane around each of our cells is nitrogen. Potassium is the blood supply of us. The main salt in our blood system to balance the water is potassium. Main thing with plants too, balancing the sap water or the fluids of plant is potassium. No special job. It is essentially the juice. You want juicier fruit, plant needs a lot of potassium. Phosphorus in both animals and plants is the energy storage and transfer molecule. So if you want to take energy from, well, the energy is from breaking down the sugar back into carbon dioxide and water it energized the phosphorus. The phosphorus molecules then do the transfer of the energy to right where it's needed, fix a wound, grow new things, whatever you need to do. In our body, same thing. You break down sugar or fat, you create carbon dioxide, water, and the phosphorus molecules are needed to do that. Calcium is a part of wood in plants. And then most of the other minerals, especially the metal minerals, are involved in enzymes that create things. So the photosynthesis molecule has a lot of. It's got iron, magnesium, zinc. A lot of these minerals are in there. That's why the chlorophyll molecule looks green. If you're missing one of these minerals, your plant's not green because it's missing. You can't finish that chlorophyll molecule. So a lot of these things, if they're missing, your plants aren't as green as they should be. So most of the minor things, I mean, like the amount in volume is so small. Like they said, zinc. One time they had whole orchard that needed zinc. So what they did is they took a galvanized nail and hammered it to the trunk of each tree. That's all they had to do. That little amount of zinc on that nail cured the whole tree. So the amount that they use of these micronutrients is really tiny, really tiny. And you have to be careful because a lot of people think Epsom salts is really good. You put a whole bunch of Epsom salts in your plants. It's not very, if you so on some of these things like potassium and magnesium going through the same channels through roots and things. They said if you put too much potassium down, you block the uptake of magnesium. If you put too much magnesium down, you block the uptake of potassium. So don't overdo one thing. So those people who do Epsom salt, they kind of cringe because that's too much magnesium sulfate. Block the uptake of potassium, which is way more important. So I've talked to the guys from the Soil and Plant Lab in Anaheim, and they go around the farms. They actually analyze the tissue of the leaves to see what the farmer needs. Because they say sometimes the soil has everything, but the plants aren't showing it. So they have to analyze the plant itself to tell them how much to add more to the farm to make it work. But so it's not easy. They said they don't know how homeowners can ever figure out what plants need because they said that they always guess, whenever they have a product, they're always guessing what it needs by what it looks like. They said they can't. They never get it right. It's really hard to tell what plants need. I mean, we know what, in general, we've seen a lot of their reports, a lot of nutrition tests to see what the plants are needing, and we kind of know in this area what we're low on. We're kind of low on potassium naturally in the soil. The soil here has a lot of phosphorus in it, no nitrogen. Most of these things are adequate. Most of them are adequate unless you really mess up your garden by doing something to it. So the pH is sometimes talked about. We don't talk about it as much anymore. The pH of the soil, the amount of acidity versus alkalinity. It's around here. It's a little high. It's 7.8, but that's mainly important if you're using chemical fertilizers because certain chemical fertilizers dissolve at certain pHs. In the organic system, it's just not important. It's not. They don't dissolve. You had a question?
I would ask you, like, say you're using wood compost, so you can assume that probably all the minerals are, or no,
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 no. So okay, so one of the things that UC Davis went around the Central Valley, and they wanted to see how the soil influenced the plant life in the Central Valley. Because they said all over Central Valley, some areas are sand, some areas are clay, some are real rocky, some are high in this nutrition naturally or mineral naturally, some are very low in others. So they went around the whole Central Valley doing soil samples and then looking at what plants grew. They said the soil didn't matter at all. The plants that they were surveying did not use the soil for nutrition. They said they merely were recycling the dead leaves on top of the ground. That's what they were doing because they said the soil had little influence on the life that they were surveying. So it didn't matter if the soil was, totally opposites. They said the same plants grew wherever the leaves piled up. The same plants grew. So they're recyclers. So most of the plants that we grow are recyclers. They're not pioneer plants that mine the soil for nutrients. They're just recyclers.
That means you need to put their leaves back into their soil.
Ideally, that's the way to do it. Right.
But if it's a tree that you eat the leaves, then there's a
Well, then you're supposed to poop there. That's one of the problems we have. See, it's that we no longer poop on our properties. Now you have to buy the stuff from someone else who's processed it for you. So
human feces is okay.
that's what we used to use a long time ago, certainly. I mean, a lot of farms that are organic, they know they have to have chickens because chickens will do a lot of the recycling for them. They said the chickens eat the bugs, they poop on the land, they're getting that soil real rich. Uh, then they also, like I was looking at this one farm, they also had um, pigs and sheep. They said they're all important because the sheep were eating all the weeds and pooping out, and then the pigs were digging up a lot of things, and they said they helped them clear the land. Actually, the pigs. So all those animals were good. I mean, it's like, what can you do in your backyard? That's the thing. How much of this stuff can you do in your backyard? Now, there's certainly properties around where you have chickens, and that's great. Uh, um, but like they said, the Midwest, that landscape depended on the buffalo. It's hard to get one of those in your backyard to do. Now we know farmer Frank, I can't remember his last name, Frank. He runs cattle in the hills around here. He still does it.
5 bar ranch.
Yes, sir. For those of us that might be worried about families that we lots of stuff collecting their own food. It's easy to tell from a macronutrient standpoint, but most of the personal fertilizer seem to report that. Do you have any recommendations for products that would have the right micronutrient levels that we could put in?
Well, anything organic has them. I mean, the thing is, they don't list them because they're not, by legal, they don't have to. But generally, if this is made out of dead plants, they're all there. So it says like this one: soybean meal, neem seed meal, alfalfa meal, rock phosphate, langbonite, which are mined from the ground, green sand, kelp meal. Most of it is plant material. In fact, seed meals are exceptionally good just because the seed is the baby food for the baby plant. All the minerals have to be in that seed for that plant to grow. So the seed meals are actually quite good. So so everything's in there. All 17 minerals, 18 minerals are in there to start with. They don't list them, but they're there.
These micro minerals, are they essential for plant health? Because the humans, they're not essential, but if you want optimum health, you need those boron, silica.
Well, in our health, they're essential too. There's 16 essential minerals in animals, 17 in plants. So if you're missing one of them, I mean, generally whatever we eat's got them in there too, because everything we eat is usually was once alive. So they had to have all those minerals also. So you're getting them whenever you eat something. You eat an animal, you're getting 16. You eat a plant, you're getting 17. Every part of that plant and animal has to have those in it.
Micro minerals that we feed. If you grow organic things in soil that doesn't have very much of that, It's not going to be reflected in the compost.
No, it should, well, the compost you make from your garden should have all of it in. I mean, if you don't throw anything away, it's not leaving very much. I mean, certainly what you eat and what you poop is gone. You have to replace a little bit, but there is some output from birds flying across the yard and things like that. But yeah, so yeah, the micronutrients we don't worry about as much because they should be there. And even though I said there's nothing in our top pot, it's got something in it because it's got peat moss. Peat moss, very low nutritional value, but there's got to be some of the microbes in there. So, and they say virtually any soil you ever come across has adequate amounts of nickel and cobalt. You don't ever have to add those. They're such small amounts needed. They said anywhere in the world you dig a hole, you'll find it. So, yes.
In making a raised bed, I use just the top pot. I mean, I got like 20 bags of top pot.
Mhm.
Do I need to add anything else to it then?
Well, you put stuff on top as you go, but all the organic matter you put on top as you go, but there's nothing you have to do with it. Well, so our top pot over time is going to we slowly lose the peat moss out of it, but the peat moss will probably be replaced by the dead root systems of the plants. Um, so it's hard to say if it's truly a loss. We haven't seen this drop much in volume over years. I've been growing trees and that for over a decade now, and it doesn't seem to move at all. But then, the trees have roots. They're growing roots. So, it's mostly silicon dioxide, just like soil is. So it's mostly the same material.
So it's okay just to go outside.
Right. Just rotate crops, put the dead stuff on top of the ground. That, I mean, the problem we're having with farms, conventional farms, is they throw away so much stuff. Like we were next to a conventional organic farm. So every crop they grow, they put the plastic down to prevent the weeds, and then they pull the crop out, and they have this huge, what are those things, 40 cubic yard dumpsters. They just fill up with that crop, and they send it to the landfill. It's nice if they left it there. I mean, they'll send it to a place that decomposes and creates compost, and they bring it back and put it on the farm. If they can figure out just how to lay it on the farm, and just grow plants in that, that'd be better. I mean, I've read about one farmer who did that 50 years ago. He said, okay, this was in Japan, it's going rice and barley. And when he would get done with the rice, they would winnow, take the rice crop off and to take all the rice and put it with the plants and lay them back in the field. Just as they pulled it out, they just lay it back in the field then plant their barley in that, and the dead rice plants were kind of like their ground cover for starting the barley seeds. But they'd also plant the rice seeds at the same time because the barley was a winter crop, the rice was a summer crop. So the barley would come up first, and then when it died, the rice would come up. And they said, yeah, they didn't have to do any tilling, they didn't have to do any throw anything away. Everything was right there. But most farms, everything's gone, and then they bring everything back, they take it away again, and that creates a lot of carbon dioxide. It's the main thing, but a lot of wasted energy hauling this stuff away. Uh, Now they have created a plastic that's type of thing that's like plastic that you can till back in the ground, and it decomposes as compost. So they've got that one now, where to keep the weeds out. But if you just now in your backyards, you just cover the ground deep with a deep enough layer of mulch, there's not going to be any weeds. That's not going to be your main problem. So we've read about these farms in small family farms, well, smallish farms, not hundreds of acres, but just acres of farms where they have their row crops, they said with 1 foot deep of mulch on top. That's always there. And when they grow a new crop, they grow their crops in greenhouses to get the starts up. And then they pull that mulch aside, plant them in, and as the plant grows, they kind of push the mulch back. They said no weeds. They hardly have to fertilize. They do admit they have chickens on the farm, uh, and things like that. Yeah, less water needed. The deep mulch does generate some moisture in it overnight. Uh, so there's a lot of good things to do. Of course, you can't do that with tractors. You have to do that by hand. So on a smaller scale, you can do, in your backyards, real deep mulch. Now, in theory, it's nice to have the last crop as your mulch, but that's going to look funny for the most part, and it's not good. Everybody's thinking, well, you got to compost it. You have to chop in little tiny bits. But that's not real. I mean, in nature, that doesn't happen. Plants don't get chopped up into a million little bits, which makes them decompose so fast that they can actually catch on fire. I mean, that's what compost does. It's too fast. Whereas in nature, things just are dead, lie dead on the ground, and they decompose over a period of a year or so. Which is, if you've got a 4 crop rotation cycle, that's fine. That should work. Now, they always say you want to get rid of your old crop because it's a source of disease for the new crop. Well, if you're not growing the same plant, it shouldn't be a factor. Now, of course, if it's the next crop over, then it might be too close. You might have to set that's the thing, our scale of our backyard may be too small to do this stuff. Because if it's a mile away, then there's no big deal. If you moved your next crop a mile, you have that much land, you can move it distance, so the disease factor may not play in at that point. Although we hear a lot of, we've seen a lot of research on disease, like on rose diseases. They said the leaves that are diseased that fall on the ground are not really a source of inoculant for the disease. They said the disease happens when the leaf is still attached to the plant. The spores are released at that time. Once that leaf hits the ground, usually the bacteria consume the disease that are on the ground. The diseases operate best when they're still attached to the plant. Yes.
And I threw it in a bucket, and I was going to put it in a compost. But some of it had flowers, like fruit from the fruit. So I thought, well, maybe I better take those away because then it might get thrown in the compost.
Well, very few things run. Compost is again like hell on earth for plants because it's all these dead bodies piled up. There's generally not enough oxygen available for the roots to even grow. So roots, the compost pile is creating huge amounts of carbon dioxide and also heat. Um, so it's not a good place for a plant to grow. I mean, tomatoes manage to grow in the compost pile. They can tolerate really low oxygen levels, but that's about it. Most plants can't grow in a compost, and the heat of a compost pile kills many things, kills diseases, kills seeds. But again, it's totally unnatural. Plants don't suddenly chop themselves up and decompose at high temperatures. It's just not a big part of nature that you say it's like people say compost is natural. Where does that occur in nature?
The other part of that same question is, could I then take the parts of the old plants, roots, everything, and just throw it on top of some other plants or trees?
Yeah. That's what nature does. But even then, if you have say an apple tree, well, apple trees want all their dead leaves underneath. They don't want something to take that away because they're dropping for a purpose so that they can recycle them. All the fruit tree orchards now have learned that they want the dead leaves to remain right there because they recycle all that.
Grass, like when they mow the grass, can we save the grass and then throw that on top of?
Of course, the grass wants the grass. When you mow a lawn, you should leave the clippings in place. But yeah, you can use the grass clippings are highly nutritious. I mean, the grass uses a lot of nitrogen, so they're highly nutritious. Just don't put them on too thick because it's hard to get air through them. Unless you're, throwing a compost pile, no problem. But, a compost pile, you're losing a lot of nitrogen. That's the thing. A lot of the stuff that is good about grass, you put in a compost pile, it's leaving because it's going away as ammonia. So it's nice just to throw the grass underneath the plants you want to feed. You get more nutrients that way.
Can I do it like right away, or should I wait a couple of days to try it?
Right away. Yeah. Yeah, we stopped making compost piles 20 years ago in her yard because we heard that the mycorrhizal fungi we talked about can recycle faster than the bacteria can. So the document that they've done, they said dead tree falls off a leaf, the tree can get nutrients back in as short as 90 days from the mycorrhizal fungi.
Because when we clean vegetables aside, and now we have the skin and the old parts of the vegetable, maybe not citrus, but vegetables that are going to go in the garbage. Can we, to prevent fruit flies from coming, just dig it a little bit into the soil around plants and then just cover it lightly?
Don't dig it in, just leave it on top and make sure it dries out really fast. That's the main thing. It's got to dry out pretty quickly. Right. Right. Fruit flies, the main one we're worried about. I mean, other bugs are more natural, but fruit flies, yeah, if you have too many fruit flies, because fruit flies normally only go after overripe things, but it's nice not to have now. You don't want flies. So, yes.
The numbers that are on the fertilizer. Like sometimes, you see different numbers for flowering plants versus green grass.
Yeah, the numbers that they put on the boxes are the manufacturer's vision of what works, and it's not realistic. So they said the average crop in the U.S. being grown has got a nitrogen phosphorus potassium ratio of 6:4. And here they tell you that well, there are certain stages of plant. Like if you want the plant to stop growing and flower, you leave out the first number. But they so a lot of these companies would say, okay, let's do a 3:6:3 ratio to encourage blooming. That doesn't encourage blooming. That just is less nitrogen, which in itself, if the plant slows down a little bit. So plants bloom generally if they have enough energy stored up in the form of stored carbohydrates. Then they can bloom and fruit. If they're growing really fast, sometimes they're using all those carbohydrates to make new cellulose in the leaves rather than saving them as storage. So you want them to slow down their growth. So they think if by adding a fertilizer with high phosphorus compared to those two, they can slow it down. Well, yeah, they can, but why just not just stop fertilizing them instead? You know, yeah. I mean, if you just put phosphorus down here, you're not feeding them anything for growth, so they'll have to. They would encourage them to bloom, but it's not the phosphorus that's doing it. It's the fact that you're not giving them stuff to make them grow faster. You're not giving enough nitrogen anymore. So I don't think those are realistic. The ones that say, like we had a product was 10-50-10, super high phosphorus. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. So 'cause the phosphorus in the plant just isn't that high. So it doesn't make any sense to get those things. Just don't fertilize so much. So, I mean, hydroponics, they have to do, hydroponics because it's almost like intravenous feeding. They can go to a high nitrogen product for making the marijuana grow, and then to make it stop growing, they suddenly change to a zero nitrogen, high phosphorus material, which slows them down the growth really quickly because it's hydroponics. And that will encourage them to bloom. But I don't know. I don't think it's the fact that they have super high phosphorus. No, it's the fact that they turned off the nitrogen, because that's the main thing that stop the growth, get the energy stored up, and then bloom. So, you know, so we don't believe in all those high phosphorus things. We use the same fertilizer and everything we do.
So going back to the compost, the mulch is 20%. What I do with my soil, I don't know if I'm wasting my time, but I grind them down and so on the bushes, you don't compost because it's so down there, but it's better to leave, say, contributing and all that whole instead of, combining it down. That's really enough.
It depends what you want it to look like. So if you grind it up, it decomposes faster and might look prettier. But if you leave it intact, that's how nature is supposed to work. And now, of course, most fruits in nature are consumed totally by the animals or stuff like that. So it may not be natural to leave half pieces of fruit laying around. Just maybe tear those up a little bit so they dry out quicker and all that. But yeah, I'd rather leave things intact. The pieces are bigger too, so air gets through better. Because if you grind everything to real fine texture like compost, and you pile it up too high, the air stops getting through that. So it's nicer to leave things coarser.
It does make cake on top, but if you put it in more.
Yeah.
But I do know it extracts the moisture.
Yeah, well, and it creates moisture too. So in nature, just so you know, they said the average depth of dead leaves on the ground is 5 inches. But in a heavily forested area, it's much deeper than that because in deserts, it's like if you say the average is 5, that means in many areas the average is like 2 feet. I mean, where they dig the oak leaf mold from in the oak trees along the Sierra Nevada, it's got to be over a foot deep. So it can be really deep where it falls. So yeah, mulch deeply. So they said in some fruit orchards they're leaving it knee depth, no weeds at all now. So now in our book, you have to maintain proper moisture. Now in many parts of the country, especially east of the Mississippi, moisture is not a problem. It's always wet. You go on the East Coast, anywhere you dig, you're going to hit water. So they don't worry about as much about root competition. Like in our yards, water is so important. Root competition from nearby trees is really important because those trees are going to suck water up 100 gallons a day or so. So if you've got your beds and they're not sealed off in the bottom with, say, root barriers, then you do have to watch out the trees there. I mean, I talked to a farmer once that had these 100-foot tall windbreak trees around their orchard, and I said, "Well, don't those kind of mess up your orchard?" Because I've tried to garden near 80-foot pine trees. There's just no way. It's all solid root around them. And yeah, they said every 5 years they run a trencher between the windbreak trees in their orchard, which goes down about 2 foot, cuts off all the roots. So plant roots go down about a foot. So if you are trenching 2 foot deep, you'll pretty much cut them all off. Said they have to do that to keep those tree roots, the windbreak tree roots, out of their orchard, or at least get them out every so often because they really still the moisture out of there. It really makes it hard to garden. So watch that in your own garden if you're doing raised beds. Either put a root barrier at the bottom or have some barrier between your setup and the nearby trees and shrubs. I mean, trees and shrubs can grow roots. I dug a tree out once and its roots were 100 foot long and the tree was about 30 foot high. So, I mean, I followed those roots 100 feet. It was just crazy. So you have to watch out. Trees from distance can be stealing your water. Since water is our number one concern this year, that's really important. That's the number one concern almost every year. And then the other thing in your gardens is ants. The Argentine ants that we're plagued with against our homes, they are in nature, their job is to bring sucking bugs to your plants. The reason they do that, aphids, whitefly, mealybug, scale, is because all those insects, their excrement is sugar water, which the ants eat. So they think, they're little dairy farmers taking in their little herd to your plants and they're shooing away the ladybugs and the lacewings and all the other beneficial wasps and things that are trying to eat these bugs. And they're causing all kinds of havoc in your vegetables and fruit trees and things like that. So make sure you've got no ants in your garden. Um, some of the native ants can do that stuff too, but by far it's the Argentine ants that are not native here that are causing the trouble. And for there are organic methods of controlling ants, but none of them are natural because the organic methods involve poisons too, just natural poisons, which are still toxic to humans. So we're using poisons to kill ants. Um, the one we found to be the most effective that we sell, but there are other brands on the market too, is the Amdro, which is a now most of the real effective baits use the same method. So they use this is cornmeal and vegetable oil as a bait. So the ants like that. That's other than sugar, that's a really good food for them. So they'll collect it, eat it, take it back to their nest. This has got a slow acting poison. Now there's a lot of organic baits we've seen that they eat it, kills them on the spot, but that's just killing one at a time. What we'd like to see them do is have a slow acting poison that won't kill them for 3 or 4 days so they have time to take all this back to their nest. Now, a lot of the Argentine ants have super colonies that might be a whole block worth of ants on one colony. So you have to give them time to collect a lot of this, take it back to their colony, and then wipe them out. I mean, we did this in our neighborhood, my last house back in around 2000, and no one in my neighborhood saw ants for the next um, uh, 10, 15 years, just no ants. We apparently put out enough of this stuff on our property to wipe out the local super colony. And everyone was amazed and said, we haven't seen ants. I mean, we were real bad with ants before that product hit the market. They hit that market because we got the fire ants in California. But when we put that out, we didn't see an ant again well, we saw maybe one ant here, but just no problems with ants in our house at all for the next 15 years. It was pretty amazing. So get the ants out of your garden, you won't have half the bug problems that you would. Um, so anyway, recycling the plants. So we're so that's a new thing. Is like the rice farmer we talked about who put the rice out. Those are just real thin strips, easy to lay down. So what do you do with tomato plants and pepper plants? It's like we have to figure out that method of recycling them without having to compost them. You know, um, since my wife doesn't like a messy garden, I'm not sure I can do it in my yard. Or you just take your tomato plants and cut them into smaller pieces and lay them on the ground and then grow something else there. So it's a new science that I haven't seen addressed that much. That one farmer in Japan was doing with his, but it was a very specific two crops that he was rotating against each other, and again he was using grass crops which don't need as much recycle or rotation time. Whereas if you do any other crop, you probably have to go more in the years, so you have to find more crops you can rotate with. But to figure out how to do this with things like corn and beans and squash, how you're going to rotate those and leave the plants in the field to not have to throw them away, that's still kind of uncharted territory. I haven't seen it yet. I mean, I'm sure people are working on this, but I haven't seen it much yet. I mean, some of the bigger farms, what they do is they just say, okay, after this crop's over, we'll let nature have it for a few years. We'll farm somewhere else. So they let nature do its thing rather than forcing what they're doing to be a part of the next crop. They're letting nature just recover the land while they farm somewhere else in their property. So still uncharted territory. I mean, I thought when I looked up sustainable agriculture on these, college websites, they would have more specific information, but no, they have the goals listed, but they don't have any details on how to do their goals. So it's like, okay, they haven't figured it out yet. So, I mean, we've heard of the one farmer now that, like they said, they're growing 60% of crops U.S. are grown for animal feed. So instead of just putting the animals on the farm and eating what's growing on the farm, they're growing it to grow a crop like corn or barley or stuff to feed the animals that we're going to eat. So they're wasting a lot of energy just growing feed crops. So this one farmer in Texas, they said he was he couldn't make any money growing corn anymore or all those other crops. He just wasn't making it. So at the last straw, he just bought some cattle, put them on his ranch, and he's done that ever since. He's making money because he's not putting any more inputs into it. The cattle eat what's growing on the ground naturally. He just sells the cattle. Doesn't have to grow any more crops. Just sells the cattle. So that's, if all of agriculture goes back, try to find a simple way to do things. That's the key is simple way to do it. Get all this moving of materials out of there. See if we can move less stuff, just work with what we have. Any other questions? Oh, I didn't. I'm going to mention the watering. So back east, they have plenty of water. Here we have to watch the watering. So what farmers in California had done century ago, before they had computers and and all that stuff, is they would walk around with a piece of rebar or something about this size and push in the ground as far as they can, because apparently, just like modeling clay, if the soil is wet enough for a plant to get water from, you can push a stick through it. If it's too dry, you can't push a stick through it. Now, plants generally on a farm, on really good soil on a farm, would have root systems 12 to 18 inches deep. In cities like us, unless you really do a good job with your soil, it's going to be maybe a foot deep. So to check the moisture on your production plants, you have to be able to push a stick in the ground right where you're watering it, at least a foot deep, to make sure that plant's going at full speed. If you can't push in a foot deep, you're running dry. The plant's not growing as much as it could. It's not putting out all its potential. It may have started aborting any fruit or flowers that it's producing because it's thinking it's drying up. So you've got to maintain the soil moisture throughout its root system, which in general is about a foot deep. And by pushing a stick in the ground, you can tell how, if it's clay, looks like modeling clay, you can push a stick through it if it's wet. You can't push it through if it's dry. And that's about the right moisture for most plants. Tomatoes may be different. Tomatoes can suck water out of drier soil, and there's probably certain crops that can do that too. But for most of the plants we grow, especially ones of tropical origin, you need about a foot of moisture in the ground at all times during that crop's growing cycle. Yes.
So if you do that, it's just like in a I would worry I would like destroy or kill or root or something.
Yeah. Well,
So survive.
you can. So if you do your soil properly, there's no such thing as overwater. So if you have the water, you can just water it. You're not going to hurt the plant by watering too much. They invented that term when they started making soil out of compost, and then the compost just rots the roots. And they assumed it was the water that was causing the problem, but it's not. The water is innocent. It's the compost that's causing all the root rot. So yeah, if, if you don't want to check the soil, just water. But again, with the lack of water, you have to know how much water. Now, in a container, what we find is that if the surface still looks moist, the soil is saturated all the way to the bottom, or the bottom is still totally saturated, it's still wet down there. Once the surface dries out totally, if it's uniform, if you don't have mulch on top, once the surface dries out, the bottom is no longer saturated. You probably have maybe half a day more until it becomes critical to get the water back. But because I've over the years we've checked, we wanted to see what how because in the days back in the 80s when we were growing plants in compost and having terrible success, we had to figure out how not to overwater the plants. So we kept pulling them out, see how the soil looked versus the top of that soil. And when the top looked dry, the bottom at least was no longer soggy. So we figured, okay, it's now there's air going through it. We can water now, but if the ground bottom will still look soggy, we couldn't water it because the roots at the bottom had not got any air because the water, which was devoid of oxygen, was still there. But once we figured out it was the compost caused the problem. Yeah, you can stay wet as long as you want. The water has plenty of oxygen in it. But yeah, no such thing as overwatering. Like when was it? 4 years, 2017 when we had that incredible rain. Was that 2017 or 2018? 2017-18 rain season. We had like 17 inches here, and they had a whole bunch of snow in this area. They just told the farmers, turn on your water, don't turn it off. You got to replenish the groundwater in the Central Valley, so just keep watering. They've found out since that the vineyards are better at this because the vineyards use a lot less fertilizer, so they wouldn't have so much nitrogen contamination of the groundwater. So if we have a good rainstorm again, they'll tell the vineyards, turn on your water, don't turn it off, because the water doesn't hurt the plants. If they turn on too much, it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper into the groundwater. Yes.
Less moist soil.
No.
Mostly won't hurt them from the rest of them.
Correct.
So, what's the active ingredient?
Well, the active ingredient is not organic. It's this one. It's hydromethanol. We've seen there's different poisons that you can get in different products, but they all have the same concept, a bait that they want to eat, and the poison doesn't kill them right away. So there's one with propanol, and there's another one with the growth. They also have some with growth hormones that make the queen sterile. So it's a little slower working. It just makes the queen sterile, so it takes a few months for the population, or a few weeks for the population to drop off as they die from old age. But so there's different ways they work. Well, yeah, because you don't have to put this in your garden. You can put this out in the street, and the ants will still find it. You give the ants a few hours of picking all this stuff up on a warm day, they'll find it. You can put it. You just got a hole in the container. They'll find it in there, take it back to their nest because this is one of their favorite foods. It's cornmeal with vegetable oils added. So haven't seen it. I mean, the other version, of course, is the sugar water and boric acid, which is another way to kill them. Boric acid is supposed to be a natural poison, although I still don't think it's good, good around your animals. But that's a natural poison versus a man-made poison. Um, it's like strychnine's a natural poison, but it's really deadly. But anyway, but there's other brands. If you go to Orange County Farm Supply, they'll have different brands. All have cornmeal, but they have different poisons. So if your ants are immune for some reason immune to one poison, use a different one. They brought all these products here because of the fire ants, and this stuff is much safer to be in a park or in a schoolyard than the fire ants are. So we actually had a customer who called up. He wanted to know how much of this his dog could eat before it killed him. And they told him 2 pounds, which is enough to cover about an acre. So this is less than 1 pound, covers maybe a quarter acre. So, your dog would die from eating the dirt before it died from eating this. So it's relatively safe. I mean, the ants don't belong here. They're not native here. We got to figure out a way to get rid of Argentine ants without using poisons. But Now, they're a real problem because they're bug farmers. Any other questions?
I have a question, but it's sort of just my own class. Shall I wait to after class?
That's fine. Good way to talk. Okay, I hope this helps. Thank you.
Those are welding, I think.